Hello and welcome to this DW Business special, all about Russia's historic debt default. This week, Moscow failed to make interest payments of $100 million on two government bonds. A 30-day grace period has now expired, making this Russia's first foreign debt default in a century. The Kremlin claims the default label is artificial and blames Western sanctions for blocking its foreign reserves. But does it actually show that sanctions are having the desired effect on Russia's economy? Well, to help me answer that question and more, I'm joined by two guests with me in the studio. I have DW's Russia analyst, Emily Sherwin. Thank you very much for being with us. And I'm also joined on the line by Timothy Ash from Blue Bay Asset Management. Timothy, it's great to have you along. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Timothy. But first, I just wanted to begin with Emily Sherwin and just ask you, how much of a surprise actually was it that Russia defaulted on this foreign debt this week?
Well, Russia had this 30-day grace period. They missed the deadline, essentially. So I think from that point of view, it can't have been too unexpected. But interestingly, of course, the Russian authorities are denying that they defaulted at all. You mentioned that the Kremlin was saying that this was an artificial default and that actually it was to do with the fact that international channels were not open to them for sending money. The finance minister in Russia as well said that Russia has done everything to lead the horse to water, but it's not up to us whether it wants to drink or not. So essentially shifting that blame to the West once again, which is what we've seen a lot in the last few months from Russia. Yeah, so what I want to actually ask Timothy Ash on this is what we can actually read into this default about the state of Russia's economy now and the impact that those sanctions actually are having on Russia.
Well, I have to say, a default is a default. If you're a creditor and you expected to receive payments in a time and a currency that's in the contract and you weren't paid, it's a default. I mean, it doesn't matter what the Kremlin says. Creditors will not be happy and they didn't get paid because of Russia's actions in Ukraine, essentially. So that's the reality. And, will it be impactful? Well, as Emily's already said, the market had already priced this in. If you go back to March, Russia's long bond, the 2047, had dropped from 130 cents to 20 cents. The market was already trading like default, right? So this particular event didn't have a huge short-term impact, but I think over the long-term, default will be very damaging for Russian economy and Russia's economy and its ability to rebuild. It will lock Russia out from international capital markets for a very, very long time to come. That means higher borrowing costs, less investment, less growth, lower living standards.
And like you said, though, a default is a default, but that's not the view of the Russian government. Let's actually get the official Russian line on what happened with its foreign debt repayments this week. Here's what Vladimir Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, had to say during a conference call with reporters earlier on this week.
These allegations of default are absolutely unjustified in this case, because back in May, the necessary currency payment was made. And the fact that Euroclear withheld this money and didn't bring it to the recipients is no longer our problem. That means that there are no grounds to call this situation a default.
There you go, Timothy Ash. That's the view of the Russian government, that the money was there, it just didn't make it to the people that it needed to get to it. So you can't really read that Russia is falling short of its obligations. Have they got a point there?
Absolutely not. It's Russia's obligation, it's its responsibility to make sure that payments are made. Right? If you're a creditor, you don't care what the excuses are. The reality is, because of Russian actions, it wasn't able to pay, whether it has the money or not. If you're a Western pension fund and you'd invested in Russia and, you were expecting the money to get paid back, you didn't get it. So I should actually go back technically also and suggest that, look, Russia was already in default in any event before this particular bond, this failure to meet the bond payment. Back in February, there were some ruble instruments that were not paid. Rating, actually, Moody's itself on June 16th called the failure to pay ruble payments back in March a default. And also there were some dollar payments in April that were failed to be paid. So actually, it's been in default for quite a long time, actually.
Emily Sherwin, so we know the impact, obviously, for Russia's foreign debtors, and we've just heard what the Russian government has to say, but what about Russians themselves? Has this news hit home with them during the course of the week?
Well, I think, this will have an impact on the way that investors see Russia. But of course, Russia was kind of already cut off from the rest of the world since those sanctions began after Russia invaded Ukraine. When it comes to ordinary Russians, I would say that there's a very strong narrative within Russia about how basically Russia is surrounded by enemies. It's almost at war with the West. And we've also heard Vladimir Putin saying that. He said that at the recent economic forum in St. Petersburg, that this is an economic blitzkrieg against Russia. That was what he said. He also, though, said in this defiant way that this is a double-edged sword, the sanctions, that those will also affect Western countries. And I think the same applies to the default, this kind of narrative that we can make it, we're strong, no matter what the West throws at us, we can kind of deal with it. And actually, surveys show that as well. There was a recent survey by the independent pollster Levada, which shows that 3/4 of people think that Russia should continue its current political course regardless of Western sanctions. So I think that gives you an idea of the kind of mood that there is at home, this really kind of warlike, defiant stance.
I think it would actually be interesting to hear from some Russians themselves. So what do they make of the events of this week, and what do they want their government to do next? Well, let's just hear from a couple of Russians now.
Russia has enormous funds, and it can pay its foreign debt in rubles right away. But the West believes that such a currency doesn't exist, and it's their problem.
There will be changes, yes, 100%. For better or for worse. It's difficult to predict. There are cryptocurrencies. Maybe we'll invest everything in it. Maybe we'll come up with something else. Or maybe we'll go back 20 years in development.
The views of some people in Russia there. Let's go back to Timothy Ash, and I want to know from you, after this has happened this week, what happens next? I mean, do more defaults follow, and does the Russian government have something in mind, in its back pockets, to try and prevent anything like that happening?
Well, I can't see a way that they can pay foreign creditors unless the US Treasury allows that to happen. So I can't see there's some back way that they can make the payment. So Russia will remain in default as long as the US Treasury keeps it in default. And that's important long term because, eventually Russia will want to come out of default. And normally countries go into default, they negotiate with private creditors, they come out of default, they reaccess international capital markets. International creditors will not be able to negotiate with Russia until the US Treasury tells them that you're able to do that. So I think unless there's a meaningful peace in Ukraine, that Russia will remain in default as long as that, we don't see that. And I think, Russia's lost. Why does this matter? Putin, one thing he does care about is military might. The Ukrainians have eroded a significant amount of Russia's military capability. Putin will want to rebuild that, probably with long-term transition away from Russian energy and commodities, and the lack of access to international capital markets means that Russia will be starved of resources ultimately over the medium to longer term to be able to rebuild Russia's military capability. Putin will have to divert resources from consumption to military spending if he wants to maintain Russia's military power. And I think that's going to weigh on Russia ultimately.
Yeah, and that's going to weigh on Russians as well, isn't it? Emily Sherwin, I mean, international community will point to international sanctions as being behind this. How are international sanctions against Russia impacting people living there?
Well, Timothy was saying ultimately this will affect the Russian economy, and I think that's very much true when it comes to the Russian people as well. Experts are predicting that Russians themselves will start feeling the effects kind of later this year. There have been predictions, including from Russian officials and from the IMF, that the Russian economy will shrink by around 8 or 9%. Others predict more like 15%. kind of we have to wait and see. There are some things that are already hitting home when it comes to businesses and also when it comes to people. So there's going to be most likely a shortage of microchips because the U.S. has cut Russia off from those. There's already a shortage of buttons, of bleach for paper, certain parts for planes and cars. So kind of very specific things, but things that the Russian market at the moment isn't actually able to replace because they just don't have the supply chains, in place. They don't have the production in place. So they may, recover from that in the long term, but it will be a long process. And I think Russians will start feeling that as well.
Yeah, paper and buttons, two things that you take for granted, but you'd be lost without them. Well, a key measure, of course, of any nation's economic health is the strength of its currency. And the ruble tells a very interesting story about Russia's. Let's just take a look now at how it's been performing since the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February. Initially, its value against the dollar plummeted, but then we saw this remarkable turnaround and its value has been rising ever since. It's now at levels not seen for 7 years. But is it all that it seems? That's a question I want to put to Timothy Ash and actually ask him, how much can we actually read into the behaviour of the ruble since the invasion about the state of the actual strength of the ruble? Because, like I say, it's not quite all that it seems, is it?
Well, it's not. It's very liquid now. I mean, there's been significant capital controls imposed. It's very hard for foreign investors like ourselves to trade ruble. It is admittedly a reflection of higher energy and commodity prices. They've helped the trade and current account positions. There's also, importantly, and Emily mentioned it before, there's been a collapse in import demand because the economy is in recession. It's kind of also a reflection of the weak state of the Russian economy. Over the longer term, I think this, Russia is being cut out of international capital markets. As I mentioned, whatever happens in this conflict, Russia has been proven to be an unreliable supplier of commodities and energy, and the West will reduce its dependency on those, whether it's this year or, well, there's a debate whether it's going to be this year or next year. But I think over the medium to longer term, it absolutely will. And that will damage Russia's balance of payments, and which is the underpinning, ultimately, of the ruble. And I think we'll see capital flight out of Russia. You were mentioned the state of the Russian economy. The outlook is stagnation, and I think it means that young Russians will leave. The outlook for Russia is dismal as long as we don't see some meaningful peace in Ukraine.
And actually, there's been warnings this week that the strength of the Russian ruble is bad news for Russian business. So what's the Russian government's plan to get the ruble under control? Well, let's hear from Kremlin Finance Minister Anton Silyanov.
Part of the spending can be left aside, and the excess revenues from oil and gas can be used to intervene in the foreign exchange market. This should influence the exchange rate. I repeat again that the final position on this has not been decided on, but I see this as the ultimate solution, a heavy hand on the overvalued ruble.
Let's speak to Emily Sherwin about this. What's the overall mood in the Kremlin? We've got an idea there, but is the Russian government feeling financially under pressure?
Well, I think it's hard to look behind the Kremlin walls, of course. The central bank, we just saw it in that graph, took some pretty effective measures to stabilize the ruble in the beginning. We'll have to see how that develops. There's definitely, I would say, some defiance within the Kremlin. As I was saying, they have this concept that they have been building a fortress economy since the sanctions first began, after the annexation of Crimea, after the first invasion of Ukraine. But there are some indications that they're worried, particularly when it comes to the effect of these sanctions and all these measures on people. So we can see that in the fact that Putin has announced some extra support measures, which are supposed to come in June and July, to boost pensions, the minimum wage, the living wage by around 10%. And that's a measure, I think, that's really supposed to appeal to Putin's core supporters, because there's essentially a contract within the Kremlin, within Russia, where Putin's system is based on stability economic stability, and people are kind of willing to give up some political rights to get that stability. Now, if that stability starts crumbling, you have to expect that the Kremlin will be worried about that and will be worried about Putin's reputation as well going forward.
What will a crumbling Russian economy look like? I'm going to bring in Timothy Ash for just one last time and just ask him, what do we need to keep an eye out for now? We've just had this foreign debt default, and what's going to be the next signifier of the state of the Russian economy, and what impact the international sanctions are having?
Well, there's a lot of focus on the potential price cap, on energy, oil and gas. Obviously G7 suggested that's going to be the case. There's a question mark about what happens to the frozen Russian assets. So over 300 billion of CBR assets, probably about 100 billion of other Russian assets. What happens to those? Are they used for reconstruction in Ukraine? And I think very, very near term, and unfortunately for your listeners, who presumably are mostly German, what happens in the gas sector? I think there's a very high likelihood of a major energy crisis in Europe this winter, because Putin's already turned the gas taps off or significantly reduced them. We'll see what happens after maintenance. Nord Stream 2 ends at the middle of July. Does Russia increase or open up the taps a bit and let a bit more gas into storage? I don't think so. He's going to be trying to ramp up pressure on Europe, and I'm really worried about a major energy crisis in Europe this winter.
OK, well, thank you so much for joining us, Timothy Ash there, and also to my other guest, Emily Sherwin. If you've enjoyed this video, then do remember to hit like and subscribe, and also why not check out some of our other stuff on the DW News YouTube channel as well, including our series Business Beyond from me and my guests and our team. Goodbye, and until next time, take care.